Hello, I'm Bill Faulkner, and welcome to number 3 in the SMRT's Safety Video Podcast series for MR Safety Week 2017. In this video podcast, we're going to talk about preventing patient burns, and we're also going to address hearing protection. This is an image of a transmit body coil. It's courtesy of Philips Medical Systems. It's an MRI system, obviously, that has the covers removed. And here's a really good look at a portion of this body coil, the transmit body coil. Remember that the majority of coils that we use today are receive-only coils, multi-channel coils. There's a few exceptions, obviously, but the great majority of them are receive-only coils, and the transmission is done with this integrated or inherent body coil. Also notice that it's right next to the cover, so this is right next to the patient. I also want you to notice that there are little electronic resistors, diodes, electronic components throughout this coil. The E field, the part of the RF, the electric part of the electromagnetic wave that we apply to the patients, the E field can get focused in these areas. And again, remember, this is very, very close to the patient. For that reason, it is imperative that you have gaps, some space, or better yet, padding between the patient and the side walls of the magnet. It is recommended that you have between 0.5 and 1 centimeter worth of padding. If this padding is present but gets compressed, you can still have a burn, even though you've got the padding, if it's not, again, of significant thickness. So that's between 0.5 and 1 centimeter. The other thing you want to do to make sure you minimize the risk of burns for the patient is avoid skin-to-skin contact. Now, here's an image that was provided to me, a photo that was provided to me, of a patient whose calves, and she's one of those patients whose you put her on the table and her feet fall out to the side, and her calves were touching right here during the exam. And if you've got a small area of skin-to-skin contact, you can get resistive losses there, and the energy is focused into that small area. And this can result in some pretty significant burns. So you want to also avoid skin-to-skin contact. The areas that are typically of a concern are medial calves, as you can see here, medial thighs, and then where you might have a patient's bare hand or bare finger touching their leg as they lie in the magnet. This is an image courtesy of Siemens Medical Systems. This is from the ERA and Skyra manual version D13. And to be honest with you, I've seen similar photos in every user manual for all vendors that I've looked at. And this is clearly showing you to areas to avoid skin-to-skin contact or contact with the patient touching the sidewall of the magnet. You can see on the right side where they're recommending padding between the arms and the sidewall, padding between the patient's hands and hips, and padding between the patient's feet, or possibly padding between the patient's legs or even their elbows touching the sides here. Again, very good example. This is quite commonly seen in my experience with pretty much every vendor's manual. Now, along the same lines of preventing burns, not to be too repetitive, in the previous safety video podcast, we talked about the importance of changing people into MR appropriate attire out of street clothes. Recall that some street clothes, certain clothing can contain embedded metallic microfibers, either as decorative, as probably was in this case here, or to help keep the person cool during activity. And these microfibers, as you can see, have been shown to cause significant burns. So another thing to keep in mind to minimize the risk of burns to the patient is to change them into clothing that we know does not contain any metallic fibers or components. It's also very important to closely monitor patients in the magnet to use, again, sufficient padding. And there's a number of things that probably could have contributed to these very severe burns. Here, this is courtesy of Dr. Frank Shellock. In this case, it was the study was a brain and whole spine, 1.5 Tesla head, neck, spine coil. It was a short, obese patient with their shoulders touching the sides of the bore. So again, no padding. The patient was under general anesthesia. And according to Dr. Shellock, who said the tech relayed to them, they were ECG monitored and there were a lot of wires. We'll talk about that in a moment later, but you have this is an example of having other things in there that can contribute to heating and can result to significant burns. Nonetheless, all of these things considered, plus the fact that the total scan time was 2 hours, this patient, as you can see, received significant burns. It's extremely important, particularly when patients are under general anesthesia, that, and this is my opinion, that you take time to get up, go in, walk around the patient, look in the bore, make sure nothing has shifted, that the padding hasn't shifted, that the patient still has sufficient padding, that there's nothing warm in there, that everything seems to be as it should be, especially if you're going to have a long procedure like this. Things can move, things can happen, so it's really important not to forget that you've got a patient in there, and especially if they're under anesthesia or heavily sedated, where they cannot tell you that they're under having any discomfort. It's extremely important that you keep a close check on them. With regard to unnecessary or non-tested metallic items being in the bore, this is an example of a burn from an EKG electrode that was not tested for the MRI environment. This is something that can easily occur if you're not careful. You have a patient that comes down from the floor. They perhaps were being monitored on the floor. They have a hospital gown on. They're dressed in MR appropriate attire, and you check them over briefly and you put them in there. And lo and behold, they still have electrodes attached to them because nursing doesn't want to remove them so they don't have to put them back on later. And you can wind up with burns. This is not too uncommon. I've heard of that type of scenario from multiple technologists in our MR safety courses and things. So it's extremely important to make sure that the patient has nothing on them that is not required for the MRI exam. And if you're going to use ECG monitoring or gating, make sure that you're using appropriately tested MR conditional electrodes. As far as coils are concerned, make sure that you visually inspect the coil cables for wear each and every time you use them. Make sure that all the connections are good, that none of the places where the cable goes into some sort of a connection, make sure they're not worn. When you position this, if you have loops, if you have cables that are associated with the coil, some of the newer coils don't necessarily have cables, which is a good thing. But if you do have coils with cables, make sure they don't form loops. Make sure that they're not touching the patient. This could form a loop with the patient. As you can see here, courtesy of Philips Medical, a good example of using padding between the cables and these coils that they're placing on the patient. Make sure the cables are not looped. Make sure they're coming straight way out of the magnet and are well padded between the patient. And then lastly in this video, let's talk about hearing protection. Just a reminder, particularly at 1.5 Tesla and higher, some of our very rapid sequences, for example, EPI, can easily produce sound pressure levels on the order of 120, 130 decibels. And the IEC in 60601-2-33 standard says that for all equipment capable of producing more than a weighted RMS sound pressure level of 99 decibel, and this again is pretty much all high field MRI systems, hearing protection shall be used for the safety of the patient, and it really should also be used for anyone that's in the scan room. as well. And this should be sufficient to reduce the A-weighted RMS sound pressure level to below 99 decibels. So that's what we want to make sure we can attenuate to. You need to make sure that whatever you're using for hearing protection is rated to provide at least 25 to 30 decibels of sound reduction. Be careful with certain headphones. Some are rated to minimize the sound at that for those levels. As I said, 25 to 30 decibels. Make sure that you have documentation that those are rated as such. I have seen some headphones that come with an MRI system from the MRI system vendor that say they're only rated for 15 decibels and you need to use additional hearing protection. Unless you're sure that your headphones that you use for sound communication or whatever with the patient, unless you're sure they can provide adequate hearing protection, adequate attenuation, you may also need to use earplugs as well as those headphones. The ACR guidance document says it is an absolute requirement for patients or volunteers in whom research sequences are being performed, that is, sequences that are not FDA approved. AP should be an absolute requirement for all patients. Personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, if a patient refuses earplugs, they should not be scanned. This should be a requirement for anyone undergoing an MRI procedure. It should also be a requirement for anyone that is in the scan room during the MRI exam itself. Frank Shellock provided me this picture. I'm not sure what he was going for here, but it is important to make sure that the earplugs are inserted properly so that you can provide adequate hearing protection. Found this photo on the internet from a website that sells hearing protection, and it illustrates how to properly insert earplugs. Make sure that you're telling the patients how to get them in so that they can provide adequate attenuation. If the earplug's not properly inserted, then it's not going to provide the intended attenuation. Greg Brown from Australia told a group of techs one time in a talk, and I happened to be lucky enough to be in attendance, a really good trick, if you will, for how to make sure the earplugs are properly inserted. Once the patient has these earplugs in, have the patient take their hands and cup them over their ears, and then take their hands on and off their ears. This is after the earplugs are in. If the earplugs are properly inserted, the patient should not hear any difference between having their hands over their ears or off their ears. If they're not properly inserted, then they may hear a difference. So that's a good little way to check and make sure that the earplugs are in fact properly inserted. So that's all we have for this little safety video podcast, number 3 in our series. We hope you're enjoying these SMRT provided video podcasts for MR Safety Week. We hope that you're taking the opportunity to reevaluate your safety practices and policies and procedures and continue working to make MR as safe as we can possibly make it for our patients and ourselves. So once again, thanks for taking the time. We'll talk to you again soon with our next safety video podcast. So until then, this is Bill Faulkner. Take care.